So our next speaker is from EPA, Dr. Paul Lamieux. Paul is the acting division director of the Decontamination and Consequences Management Division of EPA's National Homeland Security Research Center. He has a bachelor in chemistry from Seattle University and a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Utah. He has been with the EPA's Office of R&D, or Research and Development, for past 31 years, initially studying formulation and control of pollutants from combustion systems, and more recently has been working on management of residuals from cleanup after chemical, biological, radiological incidents, and foreign animal disease outbreaks, and has been working on decision support tools to aid decision makers during wide area contamination of incidents. And this is the topic he's going to talk to us about.
Oh, it's on. Thank you. So we're continuing on with the wonderful world of low probability, high consequence incidents. Back in, I guess it was about 2010, 2009, they started rigging up a national level exercise that was going to be looking at a dirty bomb in Philadelphia. It was called Liberty Rad-X, and it had a whole host of government agencies working on it. And the idea was that we were going to look at the longer term impacts and the longer term response and recovery operations, like more than 3 months out. And in the past, all of the exercises they did, they would work on the initial stages of the response, and then when they got the lives saved that they were going to save and got the people out of there, they go, okay, EPA is going to clean it up, declare victory, and walk away. And so this was our first opportunity to actually look at one of these incidents from the longer term perspective. And one of the things we wanted to look at is, how is the waste going to be generated? How much waste is there going to be? What does the waste look like? And how does different decontamination approaches that might be used on a large urban area, how does that impact the waste? And so we developed this tool initially just to use in Liberty Rad-X, and it worked so well and kind of raised a bunch of really interesting questions when we did the exercise that we continued on development, trying to make it user-friendly so that like local and state planners could use it. DHS has come out with, they call the national planning scenarios. There's like 15 of them, and one of them is a radiological incident, like a dirty bomb. And so they're encouraging communities to do planning in order to figure out how they would respond to such a thing. So the tool we came up with, it's a GIS-based tool, but one thing we found at Liberty Rad-X is if there's an emergency, the GIS guys are busy. There's not enough of them, and they're really busy. So we wanted to make something that would, get the GIS data, and then you could turn it over to an on-scene coordinator or a technical working group, and they could do the calculations based on what the GIS guys came up with. And you wouldn't really have to go back to the GIS unless the plume changed or unless the deposition changed or something. So we have, it's a GIS-based tool, and what we're trying to do is come up with a first-order estimate of the waste quantity and type, residual activity, identify where might you set up staging and temporary storage operations if, say, Philadelphia got hit with a radiological dispersal device that contaminated square miles of the city. What we want to look at is, what is the impact of different decontamination strategies on your waste? This tool is intended to be used at the strategic level and not at the tactical level. So once the incident actually happens and they get real data instead of modeling, the usefulness of the tool kind of goes down a little bit because they have actual data they can make their decisions on. But we want to look at how could waste management implications impact your decontamination strategies, kind of like a system of systems approach. The other thing is to identify starting points for policy discussions. Like if there's 20 million tons of waste that you have to get rid of which it's very, very low activity waste. You don't want to send it off to Energy Solutions and use up all their capacity for 20 years. You would rather be able to put it into a properly constructed landfill and use whatever waivers or options that the regulators have for putting it there, because this stuff is not going to be highly contaminated, but there's going to be a lot of it. Point there. So the way we broke this up is there's a GIS part and then there's a calculator part. And so the GIS part comes in our newest version that we're just putting out right now. It's a ArcGIS plugin in the toolbox. And what you have to do is you have to feed it your plume maps. So like was mentioned earlier, we would typically get your plume modeling from NARAC, which is the National Atmospheric Release Advisory Committee out of Lawrence Livermore. And when we got Liberty RADx data, it was all in terms of plumes that were like 3 nested zones. So the inner zone was the highest level of contamination. The second one was the moderate level of contamination, and then the largest zone was very light contamination, but it went downwind miles. And we need deposition activity. So we're looking for like microcuries per square meter. So sometimes we have to take dose numbers and reverse engineer the deposition estimates out of that. One of the really cool things FEMA has developed over the years is a tool called HAZUS, which plugs into ArcGIS, and originally was designed to look at estimating losses due to earthquakes or floods or hurricanes or other natural disasters. And as part of HAZUS, FEMA has this huge database of infrastructure that covers the entire United States and its territories. And it's not real high resolution, like you can't pick out a single building and identify it in the mess, but it has resolution of about a census tract, which in an urban area is about a block. So you get an idea of what kind of buildings are in the plume. You can understand what are those buildings made out of. So if they had to do demolition, you'd get an idea of how much mass would be created. It also has the square footage of the buildings, so we can look at if there's infiltration into the building, we can estimate how many square feet inside are contaminated. So we essentially take the HAZUS data, run the plume through it and figure out what infrastructure is contaminated. Then we try to figure out what's between the buildings. So you have like your concrete, your asphalt, vegetative areas, and water, and it estimates that. And then it passes it off to the calculator module, which then runs different decontamination scenarios through it in order to figure out what happens if you do this approach to the asphalt and the concrete. And it allows you to assign decontamination to different infrastructure types. So for example, maybe the people are not going to send their kids back to the schools no matter how clean you get them. So maybe we're going to demolish the schools. Or you may want to look at residences. Maybe they'll want to have some kind of low-tech approach where the homeowner might be able to participate in it so that they can get their house cleaned up if they're kind of in the edge of the evacuation zone. So the way the GIS module works is it's a single ArcGIS plugin, and it's meant to use as little GIS expertise as possible, so even someone like me could run it. So it uses plume shape files that you generated elsewhere, like NARAC. Theoretically, you could just have a picture, a map of your city and draw a plume in if you want and use that. And then it launches the calculator module once it gets to the point of having the GIS data. The other thing it has is uses a neural network approach to identifying what are the surfaces between the buildings based on their overhead satellite imagery. So it's matching colors to the pictures and trying to figure out an estimate of what's grass, what's soil, what's asphalt. The current version it assumes all green stuff is the same, but we're working on an update that's going to try to use LiDAR data in order to figure out if a green area is grass, bushes, or trees, so that you could then apply different cleanup approaches to those. So you end up with the data, and then we just recently ported the whole tool over to Access. We were originally using Microsoft Excel as the calculator part, and it worked really well. But if you had a very, very large incident that involved more than about probably 500 census tracts, Excel started getting really, really slow. And then eventually when you get up to about 1,000 census tracts, Excel would just crash. It was some internal limit of Excel. And so we wanted to move it to Access so that we could understand what happens with the larger scenarios without breaking the computer. So this is the main page that you get when you launch Access. It currently also does biological incidents as well. So you have your contamination scenarios that you have to load in. You have your decontamination scenarios, and then you use the calculator to calculate your waste scenarios. And then you also can select different GIS data sets. So this way you could look at different contamination scenarios on the same plume, or different waste scenarios using a series of decontamination scenarios. So you could look at, what do we do if we're going to primarily use wet methods to clean the city? Or what do we do if there's an inherent constraint with disposal of the wastewater that maybe we want to try to use dry methods? That's kind of what they found in the Fukushima cleanup. Is there's an area about the size of the state of Connecticut that got contaminated, and at first they were using pressure sprayers to clean the buildings. And then they found out they were generating so much wastewater that they couldn't get rid of it, so they diverted their strategy to have construction workers climbing up on people's roofs with wire brushes and wipes. And so that's kind of the approach they're using now, but it's mainly a waste minimization approach that they're taking. So you end up with, we try to have it be as user-friendly as possible, because the people that we anticipate as being the likely users are people in, for example, state emergency operations centers or state planners or local planners. They don't have time to learn how to use a complicated tool, because this is one of these low probability events that they don't spend a lot of their time on. They're worried more about their routine activities. So we want to have this as easy as possible so that they'd use it. So the way it comes in after you launch the tool is you can set up a contaminant scenario, and what we do is you can define which radionuclides are there. So the examples that we send off are all have cesium-137 as the primary radionuclide. This was originally started for radiological dispersal devices, which the scenario that we were handed for Liberty Rad-X was a truck bomb with like 2,000 curies of powderized cesium chloride attached to the bomb. So that's kind of where we started. You then can talk about the ground-based deposition activity in the 3 zones. So there's zone 1 is the highest concentration, zone 2 is moderate, and zone 3 is lower. And then surface factors, you can identify, there's default numbers, but essentially you can plug in how a certain level of ground deposition translates to inside the building, on the vertical surfaces, on the roofs. And you can change these numbers if you want. These were our best estimate based on published literature and expert advice. Then you can go in and you can set up your decontamination scenarios. So at first you can set up your demolition, and the main part of the demolition that you have to plug in is what dust suppression technique are you going to use? You're going to use fire hoses or misting, I think the Army Corps of Engineers has some numbers for the amount of water that it uses for these different approaches. And then you can establish your decon parameters for both the outdoor materials like your asphalt, your concrete, your soil. Like a lot of it you're going to have a guy with an excavator kind of digging up soil potentially, generates a lot of waste. You can also apply different decontamination techniques to the vertical surfaces, the horizontal surfaces, and the indoor surfaces of your building. And wherever possible, we've used data that's published in the literature. It has the capability, though, for you to establish your own. Like if you wanted to have mopping the floor in your house be one of the decon techniques that you want to look at, you can assign that in there. You can also assign the decontamination approaches as a function of the building occupancy class. So you could use one decon strategy for office buildings. You could use one decon strategy for residences. You could demolish the residences if you wanted to. All of that is available to you. And when we send it out or when you download it, it'll have a bunch of these already loaded in that you can use if you want. Then you end up picking your GIS data set, and these would all be a function of the plume models. We don't do the modeling. We assume that you got the shapes of the plumes and you import them. So we can look at individual census tracts. They're kind of all just numbers, but you can look at how big the census tract is. Most of these examples were all in Pennsylvania. You can look at the percentage distribution of the different ground surfaces, so you can get an idea that if there's a lot of vegetative area in zone 1, you can take that into account. And then it also can tell you what your approximate plume area is. You can see we're looking at like for Liberty RadX, it's what is that? Don't put commas in, but 19 million cubic meters or square meters. So it's a fairly substantial area. Once you get all those established, you can open up your waste scenario and look at the waste results in a number of different ways. For one thing, it allows you to have a bunch of text fields where you can put information about the scenario you're working on, so that when you crank out the reports later, you could use them to send to the incident commander or whoever's the authorities, and they can document this for the purposes of whatever response action might be going on. So again, it's a similar interface for looking at the waste scenarios. You have the different zones. You can look at the results based on census tract, which zone you want to look at. It allows you to select what your mass unit and your activity unit are for your outputs. So if you want to use kilograms or pounds, gallons or meters cubed, whatever you want, you can set it up that way. And then you can export the data to Excel so you could further massage it if you want. And this is an example of the results where it initially just shows you all the totals. So, for example, for solid waste mass, this was for Liberty RadX. It would be, I can't read that. I'm blind. But it tells you how much activity got removed and how much the mass is and how much the volume is using estimates of the density. And it tells you how much surface you've decontaminated. And the way it does the activity calculations is it's really a material balance on the initial release. So it's meant to do RDDs. You have to kind of kludge it a little bit if you want to have it do something like an IND or a nuclear power plant release. But from an RDD, you kind of know how much initially was released, and then we can just calculate where it went. We can look at the building demolition results, and you can filter it based on different occupancy classes. You can look at the ground surface results. One of the things we found is that there's a lot of potential soil is a big component of the waste, depending on how you manage the contamination in the soil. So using an excavator and taken off like the first 5 or 6 inches, you end up with pretty close to, what's this, 26 million, no, 260 million kilograms of waste, and most of which is soil in that case. Then finally, in order to document what your results are, what your recommendations are, what the options you're looking at, you can generate reports, and you can pick what you want to look at in the pop-up menu here, or you can select them all if you want, and you can print it to a printer. I usually just print it to a PDF, and that way you can look at it later. So we're right now, we just released version 5.0, which is our first version that has the biological incident in it, but it also includes our porting it over to Access. And we're currently adding the biomass, like the trees and the bushes and the grass, as an additional type of waste. So we're adding a little bit of granularity to the results from that. And we're also going to try to figure out how to deal with vehicles as a waste stream. One of the things that we've been working on for the last couple of years is trying to identify what do you do with the massive number of vehicles. There's not a lot of good data on vehicles, and a lot of them might be in car parks, so you might not be able to use satellite imagery to get them. But the number of vehicles is going to be staggering from an incident like this. You're going to have people taking them out of the contaminated zone, maybe not even knowing they're contaminated to begin with. You'll have people moving them across state lines where they may be able to rehabilitate the title, knowing it may start as a salvage title, but it doesn't always have to end up as a salvage title. So we've been kind of working with the insurance industry and some of these other folks to try to figure out how can we deal with the number of vehicles and figure out what to do with them. They take a lot of space to deal with. In a lot of these urban areas, there's not a lot of space. The other thing we want to be able to do is to tie in the transportation, and we're working on a separate tool that's going to merge with this that allows you to identify how do you get the waste from the place you're cleaning up to its interim destination, and then to its ultimate disposal. One of the things that came out of Liberty RadX was that the energy solution guys figured the governor of Utah would probably shut the facility down before being forced to accept 20 or 30 million tons of Pennsylvania's waste. And so the general consensus after doing this exercise was that the government may end up building their own disposal facility specifically for this incident that might be located nearby to the incident. And so identifying how you get the stuff from point A to point B, probably to point C a couple years later, is going to be really important. Identifying where your staging areas is very important. One of the things the community groups came up with in Liberty RadX was that if you pre-identified your staging areas, that would probably cause a huge amount of political backlash that is unnecessary because you don't really know where the incident's going to happen. And so identifying the criteria for selecting your staging areas is going to be much less toxic to the whole discussions that are going to go on. The other thing is trying to figure out how to have the policy guys understand where might they focus their decision-making process. What level of residual activity would it be okay to send to a Subtitle C type facility or to send to a facility that the government would build to, say, Subtitle C standards versus what would you have to send to the actual low-level waste repository. And so we're hoping that it would be useful for that as well. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Paul.
Hi, Paul. This is an interesting project. I was involved in some meetings at the IAEA, and one of the concerns that we discussed was containers. you're going to generate all this waste, and have you thought about what containers you would use for different types of waste, and even potentially kind of pre-approving certain types of existing containers that could be used in an incident like this?
We've had some discussions with our radiation office and our waste office about that, but we really haven't delved into it as much as we really should. That's a really good point. I'll take that home, and we'll probably start some discussions on that with those guys, because that's really important. You know, how do you wrap it up? One of the advantages, if you call it an advantage, of these type of incidents is it's not like a hurricane where you've got this massive pile of crap that is all commingled. You're largely going to be looking at what looks to be like a normal city, and so you have the ability of being able to segregate your waste very easily and be able to assign a destination for each type of waste. And so trying to figure out how to take advantage of that is going to be really important.
Have you thought about the issue of storm drains and streams and fire department activity after the event, driving contaminants down areas like that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's one of the other things we just started working on last year, is trying to tie in some of the stormwater modeling to this, because guarantee you that between the time the incident happens and the time that they finally roll in to start cleaning it up, there's going to be one or more precipitation events that's going to spread the contamination everywhere. And so we're trying to tie in some of the stormwater modeling to look at where the contaminants might go based on the topography and where the storm drains are. The challenge we have in that regard, though, is that the locals are the only ones really with the data of where these penetrations into the storm drains are. So we have to try to work with the locals in order to identify that part of the infrastructure in order to do the modeling, and we're working on that. And the plan is eventually to merge that all into this, but right now it's a standalone thing that one of our researchers and her postdoc are working on. And it's using the SWIM model that EPA has been using for quite a while on just looking at normal stormwater modeling without the contaminants being pushed around.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Paul, again.